recording. It's the
Meg-John and Justin
podcast.
Oh, that was a good
Yay. Polyphony. Who knew? So, hello, dear listener, and dear watcher, if you're watching this on YouTube, if I've remembered to put this up on the YouTube. Welcome. We are Meg-John and Justin. We are podcasters. We're trying to work out what our deal is. Like, a lot of people think we only talk about sex, and actually we kind of rarely talk about sex.
Well, it's often a jumping off point, or like we come back to it. But yeah, like mostly we called ourselves a sex and relationships podcast, but it's like much wider. I think that whole thing about how we relate to ourselves, others, and the world is kind of a good way of capturing it, perhaps.
Well, even when we talk about sex, we're talking in a really broad way about sex, and I think that the problem is bad sex education. People have a really narrow idea of what sex is and what that means.
This is it. This is why we can't sell ourselves as a sex podcast, because people assume that just means we're going to be talking about PIV or whatever.
But ideal blowjob technique.
Yes, well, which we do talk about at the end of every episode.
Every single episode.
Yeah.
So insert your own, dear listener. If you're a fan of our show, like tell everyone else whatever you think our podcast is about, and that's what it's about. But it's a relationship to ourselves and the world, and relationships broadly, but also
very
not
broadly.
Just romantic relationships. Anyway, so we're going to talk about kindness.
Yes.
And I always think of George Michael's Jesus to a Child, because there's such a kindness is one of the opening words, I think, to one of the opening verses. It's like, anyway. So now I've got Jesus to a Child in my head. But anyway, we're going to talk about kindness. We're going to obviously this is a huge topic. And I was like,
we don't pick the small ones, do we, Justin? Let's be honest.
I was texting MJ yesterday. We're like, should we podcast this week? Yeah. How about tomorrow morning? Yeah, that sounds good. And then Meg-John was like, I said, maybe we should do something about kindness. And Meg-John's like, yeah, cool. That sounds great. And I got a few thoughts. And I was thinking, And then this morning, we just kind of gathering our thoughts together. And so I'm just going to open up a Google Doc and gather our thoughts together. And then they insert like a 4-page long blog post that they've already written 4 years ago, which has all the answers. It's like, when you're doing an exam and then your mate brings along all the answers, and then you have like 15 minutes taking all the answers.
Sorry. I've been itching to do this for so long. And it was like carry on. Yeah,
so it's just a long one, is what we're saying. So we're going to split it into 2 episodes. So we're going to try and work out when we end the first episode while we're doing it. But then the second half, you will have to sign up to our Patreon to listen to the second half from just $1 a month. So our Patreon can be found at patreon.com/Meg-John and Justin. To listen to the second part of the episode, you need to sign up to our Patreon. I think it's going to be more about how we do kindness. And
we're going to dig into what it is in the first half.
And then
dig into how to do it maybe in the second half. We've done this before. We did this with therapy. We had 2 linked episodes like that. Yeah.
I think we did it. We might have done it with solo sex as well, or were they both entirely? Anyway, this is a completely legit thing for podcasters to do. Like a lot of podcasters do this, particularly those who have the Patreon and the free. This is, completely legit. So get used to it. We are not state-funded podcasters. We need your money. We boundaried, MJ.
I like it.
You can't be kind without boundaries, and you can't.
This is one of the things we're going to dig into. Yes, and it would be lovely to be paid for some of our kind work.
Definitely. Right. So kindness.
Should we go?
MJ. Yeah, you're going to start us off with a Kate Bornstein quote.
I am. So this was my inspiration for this. I all these notes I wrote like back in 2016, which was actually really depressing to come across, because when I searched for kindness on my computer, I was like, I know I was trying to write something about this way back, and it was in 2016, and it was all saying like, oh, well, we see this unkindness in the world so starkly right now with everything that's going on in 2016, and I was just like, oh god. Apparently Justin is going to bring more optimism into the show, but that was a bit my starting point. Yeah, we're going to flip it. But what inspired me to this topic was Kate Bornstein's quote, which goes like this: your dreams are not dangerous, your desires are not damned. Do whatever it takes to make your life more worth living, anything at all. There's only one rule to follow to make that kind of blanket permission work. Don't be mean. And when I came across that from Kate, I was like, brilliant. You know, I'm right on board with don't be mean, let's be kind. And then I started having all these thoughts about how complicated that actually is. You know, like, what if does not being mean letting people get away with shit? You know, does not being mean, you know, always trying to be nice to people, and that can be damaging to ourselves, you know. Like, yeah, what about when the thing that needs to happen is always going to be unkind to one person and kind to another? What about those kind of situations? So I kind of wanted to dig into that, and then never quite got around to doing so because it was so much. So we figured let's do it on double podcast instead. But I remember, like, we were in a reading group together, like way back, where we read the book Excluded by Julia Serrano. I remember being struck again by, you know, this is two kind of trans feminists writing, and that Serrano ends that book as well with a real call for kindness, and I think a little bit more working through what that actually looks like and some of these tensions. So yeah, like, I'm kind of inspired, like that's my jumping off point to this topic, is those two authors, and thinking like, can we take that baton and run with it, of like, what does kindness, you know, why is kindness so important? Why is it particularly important right now? And how do we actually go about doing it in an unkind world?
Well, perhaps maybe I'll talk about the starting point for me wanting to talk about this as well. So at this point, so basically last week, I've forgotten what date it is, but anyway, recently, one of my a lefty journalist, a lefty commentator that I really liked in America died, a guy called Michael Brooks, and it was like a very sudden medical death, and he was like 36 or 37 or something, and it's kind of really like devastated a lot of the podcasters that I listen to, and a lot of the YouTubers that I watch, that you know, kind of, that I've learnt from, that helped me inform the show. And he was one of those people. And one of the things that kept really coming out of everyone's like obituaries and memories of him was how kind he was, and how kindness is really like part of his political kind of approach, part of his praxis. So that the praxis is the I guess the actions that we do that are political. That really sum that up. But
I have never known what that word meant. Thank you. Yes.
I think that's basically it. But basically, so he was saying, and at the beginning of his final show on, so he did a show called Weekends with Anna Kasparian at Jacobin magazine, and I'd watch it, and it's because it's quite a gentle kind of like YouTube show to watch at the weekend. And on his last ever show, and the opening few lines, he said that we should be ruthless against institutions, but kind and forgiving towards individuals. And that's so that kind of what you were saying in terms of your relationship to the quote from Kate Bornstein, kind of, you know, I brought up similar things to me. Like I was thinking about how our capacity for kindness is unequally distributed, how often it's the people who are asked to be kind are those who are more likely to be attacked or more vulnerable, and how kindness is kind of weaponized against people to put them on the back foot. But I was also thinking about what do we mean by individuals, and to what extent are individuals actually like a part of an institution or an analog, or stand for an institution. So if we're criticising certain people, is our criticism only of that person, or is it of a broader kind of structure? But also thinking about the kinds of conversations that are going on online about calling out people, and also related to the conversations we've had about white fragility and this kind of surface level way that race has been dealt with, racism has been dealt with, I should say, over the last few years, and how that's hopefully changing. So it kind of brought up a lot of different things for me that I then open up our Google Doc and you can't stuff all.
No, but I'm hearing like these complexities, which I think is very much what we want to dig into. Yeah. One of which is, you can hear that blanket, don't be mean or let's be kind. And then that, and if we don't interrogate it sufficiently, it can actually end up being used against us and used to actually further systems which are damaging. And we see that in some of this stuff about call out and cancel culture, kind of on both sides of that, like that the kind of idea that it is okay just to be mean to individuals if they're bad enough, but also the kind of idea that nothing, that anything goes, that we can cancel people if they're bad. That's a complex one. And then also this piece about individuals versus systems. And it reminds me of that kind of Christian quote, I guess it is, of like, love the sinner, hate the sin. And it's almost like this is kind of a critical social justice version of that could be love the individual, hate the system, hate the discourse or whatever. And again, like, digging into that of like, what does it,
challenge the comment, not the person.
Do we stay kind with the person, but not with and what would that even look like? Because I think that is something people are gesturing towards. But as you say, that doesn't mean then just let individuals get away with stuff either. So it's,
no, exactly.
That's what we dig into, right?
We're also going to talk about the political nature of this and how actually that there is a capitalism has meant that we are less kind to each other. Like capitalism puts us in the position where we have to be less kind to each other, because certainly neoliberal capitalism is making us all compete against each other for forced scarce resources. So there's an abundance of resources, but it's the way that it's distributed to us is very tightly regulated. So we'll also talk about that stuff. So it's a very large topic.
Very large indeed. Yes.
So why now then, MJ? So what in particular?
Well, this is what I wrote back in 2016, was like, we're seeing this meanness and cruelty so much out in the wider world, hatred and fear of difference, the desire to keep safe by building walls against more marginalized people, often excluding people, imprisoning people, and that people have been shocked into a great awareness of all our complicity in the current state of how our history is steeped in colonization, genocide, slavery, exploitation of others, and how this casts long shadows over our current situation. Apparently, that was what was live for me in summer of 2016. So, same, really, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. The pandemic is an opportunity, is an interesting one, because the pandemic is an opportunity to both interrogate why there's we need more kindness, but also to find where actually there have been more, where we are more interconnected with people. So I think that kindness and the importance of kindness has been really, really clear in the handling of the pandemic. So the lack of kindness from our government and the US government and the Brazilian government, like the three main governments in the world where a lack of kindness has meant that many more people than should have died. But also how, when we're up against it, that there is more kindness between each other and towards other people, and mutual aid, funds, for example, like donating money to food banks, and the sense that, whereas I've talked about this before, I live on an estate where I don't know very many people at all, but I know that there is a huge list of people who will drop medicines around and drop food around to me if I need it, if I need to self-isolate, because I know that because I'm on that list. So so there is that sense that of more community, I think, nowadays, and we've talked about this in previous episodes. So there is, I think that's an interesting kind of opportunity to look at it, but also pandemic has made the unkind societies and the unkind governments that are living under even more clear. Like it demonstrates how what's the opposite of kind? Apart from
cruel.
Unkind, cruel.
Cruel, yeah.
It's really demonstrated how cruel these governments are, and the economic system that we're in. And
you can see that so vividly in like the statistics. Yeah.
Definitely.
And I think and sorry, carry on.
You talk about that here in the notes that there is this urgent need for more kindness in our communities. You're saying here. I'll let you talk about that, but I think that we can start to see glimmers of this, as well as seeing that certainly in America with the uprisings against brutal police violence, but also the system. There is definitely the uprising that's happening in America looks increasingly more like it's shifting from, as well as being about police violence against black people, towards being like the system is not working. It does look something more like end of capitalism kind of thing. I'm not saying it's going to end next week, but it does. But this is like a lot of disaffected people coming together on the street saying we've had enough, not just of Trump, not just of cruel policing, but of all of the things that have brought Trump around. All of the things that were the thing that you were writing about this in 2016. The things that have caused all of that have been neoliberal economics and how after the financial crash of 2008 that was caused by neoliberalism just doubled down and made it even worse for people. So I do see that with protests and with the community responses to coronavirus, there is more of this at the moment, and so I'm a bit more hopeful about this.
And I think that and that sense of it globally as well. That sense of like the Black Lives Matter conversation being like, well, we can't stick this on a T-shirt unless we're thinking about who made that T-shirt and how much they were paid, and was that another way of exploiting black and brown bodies, right? Or the sense of like climate injustice and where that feeds into the pandemic, and what about our relationship with ecosystems and animals, and is that cruel or is that kind as well? It's like that real big, I think taking kindness as that jumping off point to think about kindness to ourselves, kindness to others, what's a kind community, what's a kind culture, what's a kind economic system, what's a kind interrelationship with our planet, with other species. It's a useful, like, can take us in all those directions, and I think we're seeing some of that in those conversations, right? Similarly with the conversations in like Extinction Rebellion, starting with climate injustice and then going, oh, we can't tackle climate injustice unless we also look at racial injustice and gendered injustice and all these other kinds of injustice, because they're all interconnected.
Definitely. And that kind of leads me on to a bit that I've written about here that so this section is called Kindness as Praxis. So I talked about praxis just now. So it's like kindness as a political act, something that we do, which is political and radical. So so we are looking for examples of kindness, because kindness has been like they, i.e. the system, the institutions, are trying to beat kindness out of us. Like our actual, so I'm reading this great book called Humankind by Rutger Bregman, which everyone appears to be reading at the moment. Every time I pick up a newspaper, everyone appears to be reading it and quoting from it. And I'm glad, because it's it's a really, really, I think, important book. Although I'm still reading it, but I'm pretty sure I'll get to the end and it'll be like, wow, what an important book. Capitalist systems are built on this idea from Hobbes, the like Enlightenment philosopher, I guess, that if you leave humans to themselves, that humans are kind of evil and cruel and will do awful things to each other. And so what we need is a system and a state and power to regulate those people, because if you don't have rules and regulations and power and structures, people will just be awful and cruel to each other.
That's like that Lord of the Flies idea, isn't it?
Right. So I'll talk about this as an example. So because Rutger Bregman talks about this in his book. So Lord of the Flies was written by like William Golding. That's right, in the 60s.
Yeah.
And it was basically someone who is a fiction writer. But everyone seems to. But the way that this book has translated itself through ideas into society is really, really, and as part of culture, is really, really interesting. But just in case you don't know about Lord of the Flies, basically the basic idea is that some boys are shipwrecked on a beach, and instead of cooperating with each other, they end up kind of like acting out of self-interest, and then turning on each other and killing each other. That's the basic story. And this was written in the 60s. It became fabulously popular, and it was treated as though this was a true, inherently true book about who we are as humans. And like, to a lot of you, it might seem quite strange that I'm explaining what Lord of the Flies is, because it's entered our vocabulary and entered like the fabric of our kind of common sense ideas of what it is to be a human, that we kind of take it as read that this is what happens. But it's a work of fiction. And actually, what Rutger Bregman did was to try and find a true example of what
I read this. Yes.
He found that there is an island near. Where was it? The island. So the island was Atta, near another island, not Fiji. Another one. Anyway. Basically, some boys who were living in a boarding school were so bored with their food, they decided one day to steal a fisherman's boat and go off in search of, like, they wanted an adventure. They were really bored. They went off in an adventure, and they stole this fisherman's boat, and they didn't pack enough food, and a storm came in, and they ended up getting shipwrecked on this tiny, really inhospitable, very, very rocky island that would be very, very difficult to live on. And they were stranded there for 18 months, and they did the opposite of Lord of the Flies. So they all worked together. They set very strict like list of like chores that everyone had to do. They split up into teams in order to keep the fire burning at all times. So the fire was constantly burning. They had like a kitchen area. They had like a supplies area. They had an area where they could play games. One of them made a guitar. And if they ever got into an argument, that instead of like killing each other, like in Lord of the Flies or whatever, I've not read it. It sounds like a miserable book. They went to different parts of the island for 4 hours and then came back. And then
they learned how to do a timeout and a kind of mediation. Oh my god, it's amazing. I realised I read this. It was Tonga that they were near.
Tonga, that's it. Yeah. And a ship's captain found them. His story is really interesting as well, but I won't go. So it found them and then took them back to Tonga, and everyone was like so pleased because they'd given them up for dead, and they were immediately put in prison because the fisherman whose boat that they stole was like, no, I'm pressing charges. Anyway,
so not everyone is always kind.
They were let out, and it's like, but the thing is that ultimately, and this is like the premise of this book, Humankind, is that when society doesn't intervene, when society isn't creating these cruel structures to kind of keep people in place, people are fundamentally cooperative and kind and decent and friendly towards each other. It actually kind of argues as well that the whole idea of Darwinism is meant to be like the survival of the fittest. It's not. It's the survival of the friendliest. So
my gosh, I love that.
The people who are the most friendly, the evolutionary traits that are most valuable are friendliness and cooperation, and also learning from other people.
I mean, I think that, just to chip in, I think, I wondered if, the systemic piece that comes in is like, is Lord of the Flies believable? Because really who's put on an island is a bunch of white boarding school boys, and it's much more about the system that they were encultured in. And, partly why Lord of the Flies resonated with me was because I was bullied badly at school. But when I look back at that, I think it was very much, about that the school system, which we've talked about a lot as a hugely non-consensual system. And the bullying I experienced was very much about systemic injustices really playing out in that school.
Well, this is the thing, that William Golding was, I think, well, he was thoroughly miserable, apparently beat his kids, and was an alcoholic. So, so
it was his inner world, basically, is what we're reading.
So he's completely misread. So rather than turning his attention to the system, which causes, so the system of, as you were saying, the system of the public school, and incredibly unfriendly school system that we have generally, like often very cruel school system that we have generally, is causing this. But he's misreading it. He's thinking it's the children who
that's humanity.
Humanity. It's not. So this is why we need to be ruthless against systems, because it's the systems that is causing all of the unkindness. And it's a tricky one, because we're all living in a society where we are regulated in this way in order for us to be unkind towards each other, and that's an inherent part of, as I've talked about before, the inherent part of the common sense idea of how we're meant to live. So as I keep talking about hegemony, the Gramscian idea that this is how we're all meant to live now, is that we're meant to be competing with each other for scarce resources. And actually, in systems where you don't do that, and where we don't have to do that, we don't.
No.
So we can be kind. So that we can be more kind if society allows us to be more kind. That's the issue.
And this is the complexity we keep digging into, is that sense of then what do we do, because we are individuals in that system. And I would add, we're cultured, trained to be unkind to others and to ourselves in that system. Very unkind to others and ourselves. So what do we do with individuals in that system who are unkind? Because obviously they're going to be unkind because the system's unkind and it's been completely ingrained. And those are the kind of important questions. But I really like that piece about seeing that it is the system rather than those individuals, and that there are other possibilities which either come up kind of grassroots in our own culture. We see these exceptions, even within a culture like this, that you can cultivate kind of communities, sort of bottom up in a way, and also that it doesn't have to be this way.
But I think that kind of unkindness towards ourselves is definitely systemic. There's a systemic reason for that. Like like Juliet Jakes, friend of the show, made a really great video that I retweeted.
I love that.
A really great film about her views on like self-care, but also like politically how the history of self-care and the idea of self-care and self is very, very recent. The idea of the self is just something we've had since like the 1940s, in the way that the self has been kind of sold to us as a really great Adam Curtis documentary about this called The Century of Self, which is really fantastic.
I've got to watch that.
So, but this idea that we have as our individual self, as someone who is in some way completely disconnected from other people, is a very new idea, and that all we have to do is to improve on and work on ourselves, and also like to do PR for ourselves, which we'll talk about in a bit when we're talking about how we challenge each other about oppression. But that we have to, this idea that we are somehow completely extractable from the individuals around us is in and of itself this system. And so to see ourselves as someone who can be unkind towards ourselves is a product of that. But also, I guess what I'm saying here is that being able to be kind to given that we live in a culture that is telling us that we are individuals, starting with a place of being kind to ourselves and being kind to others, and seeing our connectedness with others is like part of this praxis. It is
really vital.
It is a radical act to do kindness towards ourselves, but also to other people, even if. Go on.
And this is really my passion. Part of my passion for plurality is that I think this particular culture you're referring to, it encourages us to disown parts of ourselves and to only present parts of ourselves. That PR piece you're talking about, in doing that, that's a cruelty to ourselves. And I buy all of this kind of therapeutic and spiritual idea that the way to be kind to ourselves is to not imprison or cast out or disown any parts of ourselves. So it's kind of like seeing that plurality and interconnectedness in ourselves, inside us, around us, and in the world, rather than that kind of split off separate self. So it's seeing the self as singular and seeing the self as disconnected seem to me two parts of the same coin, really.
Yeah.
Two sides of the same coin. Yeah. Two parts of the same puzzle piece. I don't know. Something like that.
But it's also the small and the big, isn't it? So I'm definitely not saying micro or macro here for reasons, but it's like the small. So that happens. So everything you just described there, the shutting off and imprisoning and shunning side of ourselves, happens on an individual level, on a plural level within ourselves, but also we'll talk about concentric circles again, but also with the people around us, but also look at how states treat people. Look at how we look at how we imprison way too many people.
I think this is what excited me about listening to, friend of the show, Alex Ian Taffy, recently did a Gender Stories podcast about police abolition. And I was really kind of surprised and delighted to realize this was, it does the same, that conversation does the same thing of like starting out there, but thinking about self-policing and policing within our communities. So it's always that concentric circles, and it's always, that happens whether you start right out there on the political level or right in here on the personal level. If you allow that to kind of ripple out, it's like, what does kindness look like on all those levels? Well, it looks like not policing ourselves, not disowning anything, not imprisoning anything, not casting things out, but like being able to be with all of it.
Definitely.
Yeah.
What else should we talk about in this episode before we go on to the Patreon one?
Well, we could stop here, and then the Patreon one is like what doesn't work and what does work when it comes to kindness.
I feel like we should give them, maybe we've done half an hour. Should we do another 10 minutes?
A little bit more. Okay.
Let's give them a little bit of a teaser.
So we sort of talk about what isn't kind, and then we'll talk about what is kind in the Patreon episode. Yes. Okay.
Let's do this thing about niceness rather than kindness, and kind of talk about. Let's still talk about the political elements to this. That the ways in which we look at this from let's talk about this thing that we were just talking about how as individuals we kind of because now I'm confusing myself, because we should talk about niceness rather than kindness, rather than niceness. Let's do that instead, right?
Okay.
MJ.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry, because you meandered and I wasn't really listening, so I was looking up the name of the person who inspired me on this recently.
Right. Go.
Let's just ignore your meander. There's a brilliant academic called Victoria Brooks who's written a book called Fucking Law, which is awesome, and it's mostly kind of critique of academia in all ways. It's like the chapters are called things like fucking philosophers and fucking all kinds of stuff. I think you'd like it, Justin.
Sounds great.
But again, in her book there's a call for kindness. So when we were discussing this recently on a Zoom thing that somebody had set up around her work, I suggested a good way of seeing it. She was kind of getting into this complexity of like, I'm calling for people to be kind, but people often have this veneer of kindness. Like we see that in performative activism, right? That's this kind of veneer of kindness. I better do something straight away, but actually, it lands ill with people. Like people can tell that's not, and that's why there is kind of this call out around performative activism, because if you're in one of the groups who are marginalized, you can really feel that sense of inauthenticity, and you kind of, and there's a weariness around, they're going to do this and then they're going to piss off again, or they don't want to really have the hard conversation or whatever. So Victoria was getting into like, actually kindness is work. Again, it reminds me of what we often talk about as love as an action, bell hooks kind of idea. Kindness is work, kindness is active. And I suggested, it's quite useful to use niceness versus kindness. I think niceness is that more passive version that's really concerned with how am I seen. I want to be seen to be nice. And kindness is this much deeper level, like, I want to do what's best in the world, what's actually helpful. I recognize how complex that is. I want to really, really get this person in front of me rather than just telling them what they want to hear. Again, like it's got, I think kindness has that sense of holding the complexity of it, seeing all of ourselves and seeing all of other people. You know, niceness, we can see, oh, like, okay, let's see what's good about me and present that and just pretend I don't really see what's bad about me. Whereas kindness goes like, I'm going to be with all of myself and see my capacity for harm as well as help. And I'm going to like really do that complex work of how to bring my whole self to the world in helpful ways.
That's really, really interesting. And that is really, I like that difference that you've articulated there. And that really reminds me of some other stuff that Michael Brooks has been saying.
Oh, great.
Lately.
Yeah.
And it's like, there's a lot of criticism on the left about what is a term that I'm not entirely sure I'm happy using, but the term that people are using is like woke culture. So the idea that we have to present as woke and present as someone who is, you know, pro-LGBT rights, or sometimes pro-LGB, but not the T. But anyway,
sometimes LG, sometimes just G.
Yeah, we might talk some more about that. Or someone who is like pro Black Lives Matter, and that when we present as someone when we present as nice rather than doing kindness, then what that means is that large corporations can say, you know, Black Lives Matter. So, you know, Jeff Bezos can say Black Lives Matter, the man who owns Amazon. He earned $13 billion in a day last week. Anyway, so he owns Amazon, and he's saying Black Lives Matter, but then he is trying to get a black guy sacked working at one of his New York warehouses who was trying to unionize because they were forced to work in unsafe working conditions during coronavirus. So doing niceness, but actual kindness would be, okay, let's go through the organization, let's pay everyone like twice what they're being earned, let's allow people to unionize, let's give everyone health care, and also we'll pay more tax. And because ultimately I don't think anyone can earn that amount of money anyway. But the thing is that when politics is only happening on that very narrow kind of surface level, when the only dividing lines between political parties and political movements are you woke or not, then it's very, very easy to appear woke. So a really good example of this is the coalition government of 2010, where David Cameron was like all hug a hoodie and I'm going to stroke some huskies, and they introduced equal marriage, and it's like, you know, great for people. I'm not gay. I have been married, so it's great that people have the opportunity to make the same mistakes that I did. Everyone can do that now. Fine. I'm happy for everyone. Happy for everyone who wants to get married. It's good that we all have, you know, clearly it is good that we have equal marriage. But essentially what they were able to do was to borrow the clothes of other people who were doing much more fundamentally much more fundamentally like radical kind of work. But they were just kind of taking the cherry on top of their cake and just adding it on top of theirs and making their kind of horrible, cruel and mean austerity politics look more kind, like look nicer.
Yeah.
Because they're like, oh, you know, we've got this new, we're not so nasty anymore. We've detoxified how our party looks. So when identity politics is used in that way, and it's stripped of its core meaning. And identity politics was a term used by the Combahee River Collective in the late 1970s, including Audre Lorde and Barbara Smith, and she had a twin sister, someone else that I've just been reading about by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. That identity politics is part of anti-capitalism. Like you can't, all of those things have to come together. And so the difference here between niceness and kindness is when you're looking like you're saying the right thing and you're burnishing your credentials to try and appear woke. Kindness is doing all of the things that someone that is woke does, and the bigger structural things that actually make a material difference to people's lives.
Yeah.
Are you actually really properly changing people's lives for the better? And if not, you're not doing anything. And that's the thing that Jeff Bezos does, and that's why he's kind of allowed, that's how people are allowed, that's how structures are allowed to get away with it.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Sarah Ahmed's work is really useful on this. So, you know, she's the one who talks about feminist killjoys and why we have to keep bringing the rage, which is something we're going to bring in shortly. But she talks about, universities particularly, but it could go for any institution, where what's happening, is there's a noticing of, racism playing out or sexual harassment playing out. And what happens is the diversity person is brought in and hired, or the sexual harassment person is brought in and hired. And it actually, this veneer of niceness of like, we do recognize this, we are doing something about it, allows the cruelty to carry on, often like worse, because it's actually made matters worse because there's this kind of veneer. So if anyone points at it, you can say, oh no, we're doing a thing. But actually the thing has enabled the structure to carry on. It's like, if we don't address the structure in the system, and that's where kindness in that instance actually looks like the feminist killjoy, actually looks like bringing the rage, which says this is it needs a much deeper level interrogation of the system. It's not okay simply to put this sticking plaster on that actually makes the wound fester underneath or something. Yeah.
I mean, I do see that this is happening. I do. I think that this is where I'm a bit more hopeful at the moment, is that there is, the protests in America, which are like very important in and of themselves, because it is the world's wealthiest country, and the what is it, the leader of the free world in inverted commas. These protests and uprisings are really significant in and of themselves, but also like as an analog for everyone else, because it is like people are seeing this as a structural thing and are going really deep. In Portland, they've had like 61, 62 days of continuous protest. It's really, really important. And with a lot of the podcasts that I've been listening to, often when we've had this conversation, talk about the book White Fragility, which is sadly one of the leading books that are on the New York Times bestselling list. But there are also a load of other Black authors who are up there as well. And the problem with the White Fragility book is that it's written by a white person who does diversity training in the workplace. And so
just this Sarah Ahmed approach that I was talking about. It's like, I'll just come in and do 2 hours diversity training.
And we talked about this as well, because basically all it does is it requires people on an individual level to police each other's behaviors, to stop each other from using disrespectful terminology, which is good and important. That's an important thing, but that's the only thing it does. So it's requiring the individual policing, that kind of panopticon thing of making sure that we're saying the right thing or not, or policing other people not saying the right thing, but doing nothing else. And then the bosses, the institutions, the structures can then say, well, there can't be any racism in the workplace because we've done the diversity training. So, we've done the unconscious bias training. And that means that they can kind of wash their hands of it rather than do anything.
Or even get rid of a few people, who are branded racist because they can't get the terminology right, but actually it was all on this kind of surface level rather than really addressing the systems. And it's also made everyone more frightened in that workplace because they know this individual policing is happening. So it certainly hasn't gone in the direction of kindness. It's actually gone away from it into this direction of like fear and shame, right?
And I think this is where people can see what's happening with the police in America. Again, it's an analog. It's a metaphor as well. But this whole idea of few bad apples, people just don't believe that anymore, because people could see that Derek Chauvin and his accomplices in the murder of George Floyd, they could see that they were bad actors. But then after the protests, there were just like videos and videos and videos of more and more and more. And so ultimately, when you see that it is about the structure of policing, and that there is something inherent and institutional in policing that is bad, like, is it possible to police and not be violent? And now I think that people can see that, and can see that actually we need to change the institutions. And just to go back to the point that I'm learning from with Rutger Bregman, is that given that actually when individuals are left to themselves are not put in, and not so much left to themselves, but aren't governed in the way that we're being governed. So where individuals are given the opportunity to cooperate with each other and to work with each other, and then people are kind towards each other. And I think there was in one case where for some reason, I can't remember the full story, but for some reason I think it was there was a defunding of police, or there was a police strike or something, and actually crime levels went down. So there's if you stop doing it, you create space for people to be collegiate and work together. Is all I'm saying here, and that's the I think that's the point that people are starting to get to and starting to understand. But you can only do that from this proper interrogation of what it is to be kind, and to allow others to be kind, rather than, as you say, this niceness. I think that is a really good way of kind of articulating the differences there, the surface level PR bullshit and things that are actually meaningful and long lasting.
And it strikes me, like, just to take it back to being a sex and relationships podcast for a second, if we're still trying to be that at all. But, it strikes me to this in a way, what we're always saying about sex and relationships, like what we're kind of saying is this, the approach we see in a lot of sex advice and relationship advice is to maintain what is actually a very cruel way of doing sex and relationships, which is what we're sold as the kind of norm, which is, sex that involves getting something out, getting a goal, this kind of pleasure out of somebody else, and relationships
making someone do something.
And relationships that involve, somebody belonging to you, and having to be together forever in the exact same way, and no one's allowed to change. And I'm increasingly like, how is kindness even possible within the kind of structure of that we kind of take as the norm of relationships, which we talk about a lot. So that again, a lot of the advice that's out there is just like, we'll make it nice, we'll tweak it, we'll kind of give you some more techniques, or we'll try and like, this is a way of talking in your relationship or whatever, but it doesn't really get at this fundamental systemic problem, which is that the very basis, the foundations of sex and relationships that we have is unkind, is cruel.
So see, we do like talking about sex sometimes, like
we do.
The only form of sex that society says counts as sex is the form of sex that 1 in 10 young women regularly find painful, and that only a third of women can experience orgasm from, if that is the reason why people have.
And the kind that is most frequently non-consensual.
Yeah. Because of all, and again, that non-consensual element is because of the shit story that we have around sex. So see, we can bust our sex chops out now and again.
We can, it's all same. All applies to sex too. And it's like, you could use...
Obviously, we wrote all about this in our the best sex advice book ever written, which no one's bought. And enjoy sex, how, when, and if you want to. Or Sex, a Practical Guide. Is that what it's called? A Practical Guide?
Yeah, I think so. Forget. It's on my bookshelf. I can't see it. Yes.
I think I gave my copy away to my barbers.
That's nice. It's in the barbers.
So
should we stop there? Is
like
that a good place to?
We've given the free ones enough now. So if you want to listen to How to Be Kind, and our really great, I've read the notes. Like, we've got some brilliant notes.
It's gold coming up.
Absolutely,
gold in them there hills. Yeah.
You're gonna have to tune in next week to our Patreon, patreon.com/Meg-John and Justin. From just $1 a month, though if you have more, please give more so that we can do more. We would like to make this an actual paid job, and at the moment it really isn't.
And if you don't want to wait till next week, you could go down there now. There's this fabulous episode on gaslighting that we did, which I think is, real stellar really stuff. Good. So feel free to go and listen to that already, and a bunch of other stuff. We must have 20 odd, 30 odd podcasts on there now, so there's plenty.
Oh yeah, we've been going for nearly a year, so there's loads and loads up there. Other thing as well, we talked about doing monthly questions, didn't we? We and I had an offline conversation about that, actually, didn't we? So so we did July questions, so where we whipped through some of your questions. It's been like 20 minutes on each one, but for us,
there was no whipping. It was really a slow meditation on each question.
But if you do have any questions, send them in, and we'll dedicate a free episode in August to answering your questions. If you do want to send us questions, please try to keep them brief. Tell us what pronoun to use, so we don't have to guess and try and work it out. Just it's quicker for us rather than have to figure it out. And then we'll answer those in an August questions podcast. So until next time.
Thanks so much for listening.
Bye then.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Where's the stop button? Where's the stop button? Ah, here it is.